Hey guys, welcome to this third installment in this ambient guitar sound series thing, and today I want to talk about swells, and in particular I want to talk about getting a swell that sounds a little bit like this. So that's the sound we're going for, and that's what I'm going to show you how I used all these pedals to get that sound. Basically, I'm using all the pedals to the left of my foot that you see there, but I'm going to go back to the beginning. I'm going to shut all of these guys off. And for those of you who aren't familiar with how swells work, the basic idea is that you cut off the attack of what you're playing on the guitar. So you're cutting off the initial strum or the initial pluck of the chord or note that you're playing. And typically you do that with a volume pedal. You can do it with the volume knob on your guitar as well, but the idea is that you have your volume all the way down with the pedal like it is right now, and you pluck a note or strum a chord, and right after you do that you swell in the note. So basically it sounds like this. Got it? So you're kind of bringing up the volume only on the tail of whatever note you played, and so that's kind of like the most important piece of this, is to get that technique down, get it so your foot or your finger that's doing the volume knob knows how to interact with the notes that you're playing. So you're swelling in soon enough so you're getting the fullness of the note, but you're not doing it so late that you're kind of missing the meat of it, if that makes sense. So the second thing to think about with swells is a compressor. So I don't want to go into too much specific detail on the compressor. I just turned mine off, but basically what a compressor will do on a guitar is give you more sustain. So this is how my swell sounds like without the compressor on. It sounds like this. Actually, I'm just going to strum a chord for you. I'm going to show you something here. So you hear the way that kind of died out. Now I'm going to turn my compressor on. Now that same thing sounds like this. So there's a little more sustain in the signal. There's a little bit more girth too, I guess you could say, if you want to use that word. And so to me that's kind of important because it increases the sustain and the kind of bigness of your note or chord before it even hits any delay and reverb pedals. So, I'm thinking about talking more about compressors in detail in the future, but for now, just know that that's why my compressor is on, and that's why I use it within the context of swells. So, the first thing I want to talk about now is the delays. So, for that sound you heard at the beginning, I actually used 3 separate delays, and I'll show you what they are. So there's this little carbon copy. It's an analog delay. So pretty subtle. It's kind of one that I leave on like almost all the time. And it's not super noticeable within the swell itself with everything else going on, but since it's kind of always on for me, I just left it on. The second delay is the El Capistan from Strymon that emulates a tape delay, and that sounds like this. So I've got a high mix. This is the highest mix I can go without my dry signal going down, and really high repeats too. It's almost to the point of oscillation, but it's not. And then this third delay is the Echo Park from line 6, and it is a stereo ping pong delay, and it sounds like this. So I've got a really high mix on that, and I've got a lower repeat, so it's not fading out as slowly as the El Capistan is. So when I've got all those delays going together, it sounds like this. And with a swell, it sounds like this. So the thing to notice about the way I set this up is I've kind of made the El Capistan the main delay or the featured delay. So it's the one that's creating the long tail. And the other delays are kind of just there to, you know, in the other video I talked about stacking delays a little bit, but they're there to kind of make it more soupy. And the Echo Park is really there to kind of open up the stereo spectrum a little bit. So without the Echo Park, this swell would sound like this. Which is cool on its own, but when we add this guy in, we get even more kind of spatialness to it. Since it's a really crisp ping pong delay, digital delay, it just kind of widens it a little bit. Okay, so that's a little bit how the delay section works. Now let's talk about the reverb. So the reverbs come after the delays on my pedal board. This first one is the stereo wet reverb from the company that starts with an N that I don't want to pronounce in a video. And it's mainly known as kind of a modulated reverb, and it sounds like this. So it's a little bit subtle, but it's kind of where the modulation in the reverb comes from anyway. And then the second reverb is the BlueSky from Strymon, and this is normal room mode. And I've got a pretty high mix, almost, you know, it's the same story. All these pedals really, the mix is all the way up, or it's to the point right before my dry signal starts going down. And the decay is not all the way up on this one. It's a little back from full decay, but it sounds like this. So it's a fairly long reverb, and together they sound like this. So they kind of just combine to create an even longer tail there, and the cool thing about the wet reverb is that it adds just that little bit of modulation to the Strymon signal, which is not modulated really at all. So now that we've talked about that, let's bring in the three delays back, and here's how the swell sounds now. So that sounds pretty good. That's a nice long tail, and the cool thing about it is that it, even with how long the repeats are on the El Capistan, I can play fairly quick chord changes and they don't really collide with each other. So let me just play this part again and listen for that. So they kind of blend together pretty well, and I want to talk about that more in a minute, but the very last piece of this sound is the Micro POG, and that is an octave generator. So there are three, you'll see those three knobs, I don't know how well you can see them, but there's a dry and a sub octave and an octave up. And I just now realized that my dry knob was all the way off for that first sound. So I have my dry knob all the way up, so that means I'm going to keep my dry signal intact. I've got the sub octave, so that's the lower octave, and that's all the way up as well. And then there's the octave up knob, which is the higher octave, and that's a little below 3 o'clock, maybe around 2 o'clock there. So it's not all the way up because I feel like it can get overpowering. So let's turn that on, and I'm going to turn off some of these just to show you the POG by itself. It sounds like this. So that's how that sounds. And then once we bring in everything, sounds like this. Okay, so that's the that's basically how it's done. Now I want to talk a little bit more about some things to think about when you're doing swells that can help it sound maybe a little better. And one thing about digital delays, you'll notice, I mean, the El Capistan is a digital delay, but it's really does a really good job at modeling a tape delay, which is a totally different thing. So, but I want to talk about the Echo Park here for a second. And I told you that the repeats are not super high on this guy. They're at about 50%. And I think, like I mentioned, I put the mix and repeats pretty high on most all of these pedals. That's kind of how a swell works. You got all the stuff stacked together, and you put the mix pretty high and the repeats pretty high, and you can typically get a decent sound by just doing that. But I've found that with digital delays, having high repeats on a digital delay is kind of the least pleasing sound to my ear within all of this. So just to remind you, this is how it sounds right now. So it fades out relatively quickly, but let me crank the repeats up and I'll show you what that sounds like. So that's about as high as it'll go without affecting my dry signal, and now let's hear it. So that's about the same decay that I put on the El Capistan, but I just, honestly, I don't like the way that sounds as much. It sounds pretty metallic, and it sounds just not as good. So what I'm trying to say is that be careful with digital delays. I mean, they are good in the way that I use them. Within swells, I like using them kind of at the end to kind of spread things out, but not with a really big repeats value. I liked featuring the El Capistan that way because it's darker and muddier and kind of gets out of the way, like this. So I kind of picked it, like I mentioned before, to be the most pleasing delay for this sound. So I chose to use it to be the one that kind of carries most of the repeats. And so that's just one thing to think about is digital versus sort of analog based stuff is consider not cranking the repeats up on digital based delays, and maybe crank up the ones for more analog or tape sounding delays. And the last thing I want to say really is about the reverb. So I mentioned this room reverb on the BlueSky. It sounds like this. And I've also found kind of a similar thing. It's kind of a bright sounding reverb. But if I would have cranked up the decay all the way like this, that's almost all the way. But I think you'll hear like a similar thing happen as did with the Echo Park. Let me turn all these back on, I'll show you. I still have the repeats on the Echo Park up. Let's try that again. To me, that just makes it a lot muddier. And I don't even have these two pedals on. Let me turn these on. It still works pretty well, but I feel like the chord changes got a little muddier. The cool thing about where it was before is that it kind of enabled stuff to get out of the way quicker. And so really what it comes down to is just knowing your pedals, know which ones can build up and sort of get funky sounding when there's too much of it there, and sort of dial back on those. So for my setup, it was the BlueSky and the Echo Park that kind of I needed to dial back on and figure out what delays or reverbs sound best with longer repeats and feature those in your swell as opposed to the other ones. And the very, very, very last thing I want to say is, people criticize me and probably criticize you if you have more than one delay pedal. They don't understand why you would want 3 like I have here, and say, you know, why wouldn't you just get like a preset delay that can handle all those different sounds? But the thing those people are missing is the possibilities that you have when you stack delays. So if I just had one preset delay like the Timeline, you know, I can't run one of their delay machines into a different tape machine. You know, it's just one delay I could have going anytime. But the whole point that I have 3 is I can do stuff like this where I stack all the different delays, and you get the soupiness, you get the different frequencies from a digital delay versus an analog delay or a tape delay going together. And it's the exact same thing with reverbs too. So those are some things to think about. Stay tuned for this next video. I want to talk about the chord voicings and stuff for this type of sound. So we'll talk to you next time.